As she went back home after a long day, Gina was suddenly attacked by 3 men. She thought no one could help her, but then a wolf came out of the woods and did something incredible. Gina was tired and couldn't wait to get home. She just wanted to sleep. Visiting the hospital was exhausting. The dark road made her slightly nervous, despite the fact that she had always loved that forest as a child. As a kid, it was her happy place. Her parents moved a lot for work, and it was only at her grandparents' cabin that she felt like she was completely at home. But there were sad times there too, especially when they lost Gina's grandfather. Her grandmother was one of the strongest people she had ever known, the type of person who acts like she is fine while taking care of everyone else. This time, Gina was determined to take care of her grandma instead, so she went to live with her for a while. After a while, her parents came to visit, and they spread her grandfather's ashes all together at his favorite spot by the river. They had lost someone important, but unbeknownst to them, that day, they were also going to gain a new friend. Her grandmother wanted to stay by the river for a while longer, and while Gina's parents went back to the cabin, she waited in silence until the old woman was ready to let go. Then, they slowly started walking back home. They were united in their sorrow, but they took comfort in this beautiful place that Gina's grandfather loved so much. But suddenly, both women stopped and listened. There was a moaning sound coming from somewhere close by. They heard a little howl, one that sounded painful. They walked towards the sound and were shocked by what they saw. A tiny gray puppy sat under the bushes. He had scars on his nose and had an injured leg. They had no idea what had happened to him, but he had been through something horrible. Without even thinking, Gina went closer to pick him up. Her grandmother warned her to be careful, but she was already clutching the tiny wolf to her chest. They looked around for the mother or any siblings, but there were no signs of them. The pup had snuggled into Gina and was a lot calmer in her arms. His leg looked broken, and those wounds needed to be taken care of. After careful consideration, the 2 women decided that the puppy was coming home with them to the cabin. Of course, Gina's parents weren't happy. They were hoping to convince her to move back to the city and bring her grandma with her too. A cabin in the middle of the forest wasn't a safe place for a lone woman, especially for an older lady with a wolf cub as a pet. They wanted her to move into a retirement home, but Granny wasn't interested in any of that. She would stay in the cabin for as long as she wanted, and her granddaughter could live with her too. Gina was grateful. She loved it there. She spent most of her life in boarding schools in the city while her parents traveled for work, so this cabin was the only home she ever had. And besides, she needed a place to take care of the puppy. She and her grandma put a splint on his leg and bandaged it up. Then, they cleaned his nose and put ointment on. He was happy to stay still as long as Gina was holding him. They fed him, and he even slept in Gina's bed that night. He was as sweet as a puppy dog, and both women immediately understood that he would never be a danger to any of them. It was a relief when Gina's parents left the next day. They were critical and extremely unhappy with their daughter's plan for the future. She had decided to do online college and stay with her grandmother for at least a year, and they worried that she would feel completely out of place when she finally went back to the city. But she didn't care. She loved the cabin, the forest, and her grandma, and she now had a little puppy to raise too. Silver loved her from the very first second. He followed her everywhere, and under her care, he grew into a majestic creature. Silver was getting massive, and he wasn't even a year old yet. He was one of the biggest animals Gina had ever seen. As she watched him run free in and out of the forest, she told her grandmother that she didn't know what was going to happen when she had to go back to the city. How would she ever find a place with a garden big enough to keep him? That was when her grandmother told her something shocking. Gina couldn't take Silver to the city. He belonged in the forest. When Gina just looked at her for an explanation, her grandmother explained that a wolf couldn't safely be kept in a house. Gina was a city girl at heart, and her eyes weren't trained to tell big dogs and wolves apart. This was the first time she realized that Silver wasn't just an abandoned puppy left in the forest. She had always thought it was a strange mixed-breed dog, and now she had to hear he was a wolf. Gina was shocked. Her grandmother laughed at her, but then reassured her when she saw how distressed the girl looked. Knowing Silver was a wolf wouldn't change their relationship. The wolf was devoted to her. He would sleep by her feet while she did online classes, and even if he would run ahead when they went for walks in the forest, he would always come back to her when she called. By the time he was fully grown, Gina couldn't believe that she ever had him mistaken for a dog. He was massive. Still, he had the biggest heart, a heart that she was about to break. They had been together for a long time, but Gina would soon be forced to leave and go back to the city. She had to do a practical part of her degree, and she could only do that in the city. It broke her heart to leave her grandmother and Silver, but she would be back as soon as she could. Saying goodbye was sad, and she hugged Silver with tears in her eyes. She loved the wolf so much, and she hoped he didn't think she was abandoning him. Once in the city, she settled into a small apartment and phoned her grandmother right after the first day of work. They talked for a while, and then she asked how Silver was doing without her. Gina could not believe her ears when her grandmother apologetically told her that the wolf was gone. He had run into the forest right after Gina had left and hadn't come back again. Gina was shocked. The wolf could look after himself, but the thought of never seeing him again was horrible. She couldn't imagine the cabin without Silver, but as much as she hoped he would come home, he never did. She asked her grandmother often, but Gran never saw Silver after Gina moved. The girl had to move on, and thanks to the many friends she made at college, she eventually did. But when Gina finally finished her degree, she was tired of the city. She would give anything to get back to the cabin, but she knew she had to find a job now. Thankfully, her company offered her a remote position. It was everything she had hoped for, because she could finally go home. She packed her things in a haste, ready to go back to the only place she had ever loved. Then, her mother phoned. Gran was sick. She was in the hospital with pneumonia, and the doctors weren't sure if she would make it. As soon as Gina disconnected the call, she got into her car and drove to the village. She needed to see her grandmother. She looked weaker than she ever had been, but she still managed to smile at her. Her mother was there too, but she had work meetings coming up and had to leave the next day. For days, Gina sat next to the hospital bed and only went back to the cabin to sleep. Then, Gran took a turn for the better. Gina was incredibly relieved. She couldn't face the loss of her grandmother, and now she wouldn't have to. Soon, Gran started asking to go home, but it was still too soon. She had to be patient until the doctors would release her. But Gina did think of a way to help her feel better. She brought her a change of clothes and helped her bathe and do her hair. At the end of the day, Gran felt a lot better. Getting her grandmother ready took some time, and it was pretty late when Gina got into her vehicle that night. She didn't like to drive the dark roads that late, but it was worth it to see her grandmother happy. As she drove, Gina was tense. She had this strange feeling that she was being followed, but she couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. No one was around when she parked her car, and she breathed a sigh of relief. However, she didn't know that a group of men had followed her a few times in the last few days. They knew where she was going and had stopped their car a short distance away so she wouldn't notice them. Gina grabbed her bag and got out of the vehicle. She held the cabin key ready to open the door and get inside, but she was only halfway to the door when she was suddenly surrounded by 3 men. Where did they come from? Gina didn't know, but she was sure that they couldn't mean well. Suddenly, the men grabbed her bag and her car keys. Gina was happy to give those up. She just wanted them to take what they wanted and leave her alone. But that wasn't their plan. The group attacked her, trying to pull her towards the vehicle. She was terrified of what they would do if they could move her away to another location. She screamed as loud as she could, but they didn't even seem to notice. Just like Gina, the men knew that no one would hear her out there. She was alone, or at least that was what they all thought. Then, suddenly, a silver shadow came rushing out from the forest. It was a huge wolf. The wolf grabbed the men and pulled them off of Gina, piercing their skin with its massive fangs in any place he could reach. While the 3 tried to defend themselves against the predator, Gina fell back on the ground in shock. The wolf was relentless, and for a split second, she was worried that he would soon turn on her too. But when the moonlight shone on his snout, she saw the scars on his nose and recognized her old friend, Silver. He had come back to save her. The men scattered away, but Silver was not going to let them go that easily. He ran after them, and their only option was to climb a tree. The wolf sat in front of the tree, his teeth bared. It was clear that he wasn't going to let them leave unharmed. Gina cried for a second, but then she took inspiration from her grandmother and pulled herself together. She would have a meltdown later, but now she had to act. She called the sheriff, and within minutes, 4 officers arrived. The men were quickly apprehended, and she was escorted inside her house by the sheriff himself. He explained to her that this group of men had been terrorizing people all around the village, but that thanks to her and Silver, they wouldn't bother anyone else. There was no telling what would have happened if Silver hadn't come and helped his friend. He was there when she needed him, and when she did cry after everyone left, he sat against her while she held him. The wolf was just as devoted to Gina as he had always been. She didn't know how he knew she was home and needed him, but she would forever be grateful that he did. He stayed with her for the next several days while she recovered from the scary ordeal, and even slept in her bed the first night, like he did when he was a puppy. He didn't leave much space for the young woman, but she didn't mind. It wasn't long after that when her grandmother was released from the hospital. From then on, the wolf would come and go from the cabin as he pleased. He had the best of both worlds, a life in the wilderness like nature demanded, and the company of his best friends in the whole world. They saved him as a puppy, and now he was their guardian. They knew he would be there if they needed him, and that was a pretty great feeling. What a scary story. Do you know anyone who has been saved from a dangerous situation by a loyal pet? Tell us in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Join us again for even more incredible stories.